Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you happen to be. We'll be starting this webinar in exactly 1 minute. I want to thank everyone for joining today. We'll be getting started shortly. And in preparation for starting, I'm going to shift the screen so you can see my slide presentation instead of my face. So please bear with me while I make this change. And now people should be able to see my screen. "15 seconds. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you happen to be. One of the nice things about webinar technology is we can communicate with people all over the world. So wherever you happen to live, I want you to know that I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on today's webinar. The topic for today is faith and leadership. It's one of the many ways in which you can catch the spark to then be one. Our company is called Level 3 by Design. My name is Keith Weidman. I'm the principal of Level 3 by Design. We help our clients hone leadership skills, and we focus on specific skills as affecting change, unleashing creativity, and empowering people. Let me tell you a little bit my story as it relates to my faith and this particular webinar. When I graduated from college, it was my faith that led me into the field of helping people. I began in Indiana's welfare system, and at the age of 25 was once the youngest county director in the state of Indiana. Then by the time I was in the system as a county director for 8 years, I was not satisfied, because in spite of our best intentions to help people, what I knew was, for the most part, most of the people that we were supposed to be helping did not truly feel as if what we were doing was all that helpful. So I began looking for a more effective way to help people. I was lucky enough to stumble upon a 64-hour course that covered 8 days. In this course, I learned how to affect change in people. It was 64 hours, 8 days, and I was so excited by my ability to affect change in people afterwards that I then signed up to get a master's degree to study from this thought leader, get additional clinical training at the same time, get my master's degree in psychology. So then over the course of the next 2 years, I worked full-time during the day as a county director in the Indiana's welfare system, and then I studied at night and took 4 weeks of vacation each year, which was all of my vacation, to get clinical training in this discipline practice. So obviously, what happened to me was I found myself taking what I was learning about affecting change in people and thinking about, well, what does this have to do with the organization that I work for and the people that we serve? So by the time I had my degree, I knew it was impossible to empower an organization and even a county's welfare system with the information I was learning. So then I made a commitment to do one thing each day to affect change within Indiana's welfare system and within the county office in which I worked. What started off as doing one thing each day quickly became a second full-time job, where the pay was non-monetary. And when I first started this training, I must confess to you that I was not very strong in my faith. But then what happened, I found myself surrounded by people of faith that were involved in the work we were doing because they cared and they wanted to volunteer and get involved. One of the most meaningful people that I worked with for those 7 years was Pastor John Stacy. He was the minister at Christ Lutheran Church. And while I was not a member of his church, he probably mentored me more than any other minister during my entire life to date. And I've been involved in churches for a number of years. What he did was he shared with me Bible parables that parallel with the work that we were doing. So we would have a success, and he would talk about a parable in the Bible that typically involved Jesus in a similar way. So today, what I want to do is I want to help you become a more effective leader while at the same time deepening your faith. I'm going to do this by sharing with you some of the best ideas that I've learned from something called a discipline practice, and then helping you see how these ideas today are connected to my faith. So this is a picture of my parents, and my parents have been very truly effective parents and really an inspiration for me in my life. And when I started focusing on effecting change in Indiana's welfare system, my father and my mother were both retired. My father was almost 69 years old and been retired since age 62. I used to call my parents several times each week, and I would share with them some of the excitement that I was experiencing. One day I'd call them up and I'd say, Mom and Dad, I'm so excited. I talked with the mayor of Crawfordsville, Indiana, and he's going to be personally involved in our work. The next day I would call and I'd say, Mom and Dad, I'm so excited. I had an appointment today with the CEO of Ray Bestis Enterprises, and he's going to be involved in our work. So over the course of 2 months, I had many phone calls just like those two. And then my father, when he was almost 69 years old, got a psychology game out of the attic that he invented when he was a young man in his 20s. He transformed that game into a program that used open-ended questions that would cause young people and adults to think, reason, and solve problems without violence by using a trained facilitator in leading a group discussion and using positive peer influence. My father then proceeded between the ages of 70 and 80 to travel around the United States and also travel some in Canada. And he would work with adults who work with juvenile offenders and also adult offenders in how to facilitate group discussions using open-ended questions that would cause positive peer influence to affect change. My father's work culminated in presenting at 2 national conferences. One was in Atlanta, Georgia for the juvenile justice system in the United States. The other was in Toronto, Canada, for the juvenile justice system in Canada. While I cannot tell you how many people whose lives my parents touched through the work that they did, and by the way, I did say my parents, you see, my mother typically traveled with my father as he traveled from facility to facility, and my mother was a retired French and English teacher, so she would often coach my father on his use of language and would also edit his writings and the work that he did. So you could say they had a very unusual retirement. And what I would say to you is my father felt called to do this work, and my mother felt called to support him. And the difference that they made through the work that they did clearly made a difference. So here's a few questions for you to think about. And these questions have to do with leadership and faith. How does your faith impact your organization? How does your faith impact your organization? I'll be pausing about 30 seconds after each question to give you a chance to think about your response. How does your faith and your faith-based values expand your effectiveness as a leader? What God-given gifts can you improve to become more effective as a leader? How effective can you become in empowering people as a faith-based leader? Thank you. So today I'm going to provide you with 3 ideas you can use to become more effective as a leader. I'm going to connect these ideas to the Christian faith and help you connect them to your own faith, recognizing your faith may be different than Christian. I'm going to unleash your God-given gift to empower people. And I'm going to provide you with a daily call to action to empower people and further develop this precious gift that we all have. Sound good? Well, let's get going. So here's some food for thought for you to think about as we get started today. One is a quote by Jose Arguelles. He once said, "The failure of Christian civilization or any other has been in its inability to live by the examples of its teachers." So perhaps when it comes to our faith in God and in one another, we often fall short. Perhaps when it comes to core faith-based values, such as love, acceptance, care, compassion, forgiveness, and being non-judgmental, we also fall short. So I'm going to take you on a different fork in the road. It's called the disciplined practice of constructivist thinking. And I've actually invested 16,000 hours in this disciplined practice. And what I've learned very, very long time ago in the first 1,000 hours is how this disciplined practice is connected to my faith. But before we go on to this fork in the road that's less traveled, that most people don't even know exists, let's spend just a moment or two focusing on the traditional fork that we're leaving. From the traditional fork, where most people live their lives, knowledge provides accurate information about the world in which we live. Scientific theories that hold up to rigorous experimentation are considered to be proven. In other words, actual discoveries about how the world truly works. And perceiving is seen as a passive act. And our 5 senses then provide us with an accurate picture of the world as it truly is. We live our lives as if the way we see it is the way the world is. And that's why you have people today, some are Republicans, some are Democrats, each of them convinced that the way they see it is the way it is, that the other way of looking at it is wrong. We also assume no responsibility for the impact of our critical judgments upon those judged. And while we may confess our sins each week when we're at church, we are not necessarily aware of when and how our actions are inconsistent with our faith and our faith-related values. So what I learned about was something called constructivism. It's a big word. You may or may not have heard of it before, but let me show you where this word comes from. If you look at the chart, you can see that there's philosophy at the top. And then below philosophy, there's different branches of philosophy. There's psychology, and there's science. And then there's epistemology, another uncommon word. And what epistemology is, it's a study or a theory of the nature and grounds of knowledge, especially with reference to its limits and validity. And then constructivism is a specific theory about epistemology. And the theory is, in essence, that reality cannot be known with certainty. All that can be known with certainty is what reality is not. So what in the world does this have to do with anything? Well, let's focus a little further on the field of science then, from this road less traveled, this disciplined practice. You might recognize the face in the picture. It's Albert Einstein. He once said that no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. You could say he had the mindset of a true scientist. And what I'm inviting you to do is take the mindset of a true scientist and apply it outside of the field of science. And when you do, you'll understand that reality cannot be known with certainty. All we can know with certainty is what reality is not. So let's take a look at knowledge from this discipline practice. We're talking about mankind's knowledge now, so I'm going to exclude the Bible from this knowledge. And mankind's knowledge more or less fits reality. It is not an exact match. This knowledge can be applied selectively when useful in achieving a result. Knowledge, just like beliefs, can actually be limiting. Limiting knowledge and limiting beliefs can readily be set aside instead of constraining anyone. So let me share with you a story that answers the question, can an old dog learn a new trick? I was doing a training session for an organization. I was talking to the middle manager. The focus of this particular training was on feedback. And the middle manager I was talking to was talking about what happened each time he received constructive feedback from his supervisor. What he shared with me was every time his supervisor had constructive feedback to give him, they had a closed-door conversation. That conversation would typically last an hour long, and during the course of that conversation, you'd have two people whose voices would get quite raised, quite loud, and you might say they got quite argumentative with one another. But then he proudly said that each and every time they did this, they always worked through their differences, and they always came out of those conversations, both of them being okay. So I asked him a question. I said, is it possible for him to receive constructive feedback and just simply get it for what it is, helpful feedback? His comment to me in response was, you can't teach an old dog a new trick. And he considered himself an old dog, and he was in his mid-60s and close to retirement. So then, in front of a room full of people, about 16 to 20, including his direct reports, his supervisor, and his peers, I proceeded to give him constructive feedback in front of everyone. And guess what he did? He did not resist that feedback whatsoever. He simply heard it, understood it, and accepted it. And he was the last person in the room to realize that I just taught an old dog a new trick. You see, he was blind because his past experiences were that he was someone who could not easily accept constructive feedback. So he's actually blind when he was able to accept it. He was the last one to see that he'd just done what he didn't believe was possible, because his prior experience about himself and how he was wired was that was not possible for him. So let's now focus on perceiving from this discipline practice. There's a gentleman named Aneurin Bevan, and he was a parliamentarian in the British Parliament in the 1950s. And he once stated, it is inherent in our intellectual activity that we seek to imprison reality in our description of it. Soon, long before we realize it, it is we who become the prisoners of the description. So a quote from me is, it is a particular way of perceiving reality, not reality itself, that constrains you or your team members in achieving the results that you really want. And critically judging others is one way of perceiving reality in an especially dysfunctional way. So we're going to now make our first connection with faith. Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not that ye not be judged. What I can tell you is that when you're being critically judged, easily to get hooked. Anyone can get hooked when they're being critically judged by others. So let me tell you a little more about what I'm talking about from actual experience. During the course of 7 years when I was involved in effecting change in Indiana's welfare system, we had a lot of success stories. These were people who were changing their lives for the better, making great strides to become self-sufficient, and they had had so much success that they became featured in a newspaper article. In the articles in the newspaper, these are quotes from them about the impact of critical judgment. So these were people that were successful, that were turning their lives around, talking about how hard it was to be critically judged. One person named Lisa said, "It was hard being criticized by others when she used food stamps at the grocery store. Quote, I don't think people realize how much it hurts. I still feel kind of small," end quote. Another person said, "Humiliation makes you very bitter in the welfare system. You get very defensive." Another person said, "It's hard to believe in yourself when many people are critical of people on welfare." And finally, someone said, "I had a chip on my shoulder because of welfare. There's so much frustration and humiliation. I get upset when people say that those on welfare are lazy." So let me tell you a story about Mark. And we're not talking about the Bible Mark. We're talking about somebody named Mark that I used to know. I used to believe 10% of the people who received public assistance were bad apples. And it was those bad apples that created a negative image of the entire welfare system for the rest of the people. And I used to think, if we could just do something with those 10% of the people, the welfare system could really work. Because it was those 10% that caused everyone else to be perceived in such a negative light. So here's what I knew about Mark before I had a confrontation with him. I knew that he had a felony conviction on his record and he'd served hard time in state prison. I knew he was a very violent person and that whenever the police received a report that involved a domestic disturbance where Mark was involved, that they always sent 2 squad cars with 4 officers at the time because they knew that if Mark was involved, chances were it was going to be a very volatile situation. Mark was known to have a very violent temper and be a very violent person. He had once attacked a detective from behind with a knife. And he was built like Popeye. He was one of those powerful people that I knew at the time. And so here's what happened. It was one of the first 3 working days of the month, and the lobby was filled with people picking up their food stamp benefits. I heard a loud commotion in the lobby. And as a county director, I typically saw it as my job to intervene whenever somebody got out of hand. Typically, as a county director, when I would intervene, people would calm down because I was in a position of authority. And people typically responded to authority in a positive way. So I stepped in to intervene, to calm things down, and I found myself confronted face to face with Mark for the first time. Except Mark didn't calm down. Instead of calming down, he actually threatened me. He said either I was going to give him his food stamps or he was going to beat the tar out of me, except he did not use the word tar. So all I could think was get him out of the lobby and away from all these other people. So I got him into my office and I closed both doors. So you might say that I was being protective of everyone else in the office, or you might say that I was a little bit foolish because I was putting myself at risk. I spent the next 90 minutes in my office just with me and Mark. And I can tell you it was one of the most intense experiences of my life. During the course of those 90 minutes, much of the conversation went something like this. He was going to beat the tar out of me unless I gave him his food stamps. If he beat the tar out of me, I was going to have him arrested. If I had him arrested, he was going to get bail and he was going to come back and beat the tar out of me again. And that's how the conversation went for much of the 90 minutes. And I must tell you that I was quite fearful during those 90 minutes. For much of the time, my armpits were sweating. In fact, it was like I had water trickling down the sides of my armpits. I was sweating so much. My shirt became drenched and it even soaked through to my sport coat. And yet there I was in this intense conversation with Mark. And at the time I had crisis intervention training and I used every skill that I had to get out of that situation without getting the tar knocked out of me and without giving him food stamps. Because if I gave him food stamps, it would be considered theft. And the last thing in the world I wanted to do was to have him arrested for theft out of a situation that would be a lose-lose endeavor. So I was able to work myself out of that situation, and we worked out a compromise. He didn't knock the tar out of me, and I didn't give him his food stamps that day. But I did arrange for him to come back within just a couple days for an appointment. All he needed to do is to be recertified for food stamps, and then he'd get his benefits. But his benefits had expired, and I couldn't give him more benefits until he'd been recertified as eligible. So in that intense conversation, you might say we bonded a little bit. So the next time I saw him, when he came in to get his food stamps, we small talked in the lobby. And it was interesting. It was kind of like we were really friendly with each other. It was as if we already knew each other and were friends. So I thought about Mark over the course of the next 30 days, and I was in this clinical training about what's possible to affect change. So I thought, what if Mark really wanted to work? And one of the things that I knew about Mark was I'd received more complaints about Mark than anyone else who was on public assistance. People used to call the office angry and upset because Mark had told them, why should I work when I can get food stamps? So Mark, in my book at the time, was the #1 worst offender of all those people who caused everyone else to have a negative impression of those on food stamps. So here's a guy who says, why should you work when you get food stamps? The next time I saw him, I thought, well, what if he really wanted to work? So I approached him and I said, say, Mark, what if I was to help you get a job? So we had a conversation, lasted maybe 5 minutes. Mark said he wouldn't do janitorial work, that was beneath him. He said he wouldn't work in a factory because that was too hot and dirty. The only thing he said he would do that day would be drive a bread truck. He talked about how he thought it'd be cool to drive around town in a bread truck delivering bread. So Mark left that day thinking I was going to help him find a job driving a bread truck. After he left, I thought about it. I thought to myself, here's a guy, anger, violence issues, felony conviction on his record, and all he'll do is drive a bread truck. He's too picky. I'm not going to do anything. So he came back in 30 days later. We saw each other in the lobby. We had a small talk conversation. It was friendly once again. And then he popped the question. He asked me, how's his job search going? He asked me how his job search is going. So I told him, I said, I haven't done anything. He said, what do you mean you haven't done anything? I said, well, you're too picky. What do you mean I'm too picky? You won't work in a factory. And just like that, he looked at me without hesitation. He said, I'll work in a factory. I did not get Mark a job. I got him an interview. I called an HR person I know. That person in turn connected with a foreman that was hiring. And then Mark did so well in the interview that he was able to persuade that foreman to take a chance and hire him. Then I started getting weekly phone calls from that HR person that I knew. Mark is really knocking himself out to impress his supervisor. Mark is outperforming everybody on the line. Mark is working so hard, he really wants to prove himself. So I saw Mark 30 days later, and I said, I just want to acknowledge you for the steps you're taking to change your life in a positive way. So let me take you lunch as one way that I can acknowledge you. That's when I saw for the first time a very different side of Mark. I learned that when Mark went into a restaurant, that he was paranoid that people were looking at him. And so he never went into restaurants. I was able to persuade him to go into a restaurant with me. And sure enough, when we had lunch together, there he was with his eyes darting from table to table to see who was looking at him. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that how his actions were actually causing people, drawing people's attention to him. So his paranoia was so significant that his behavior actually caused people to do the very thing he was paranoid that they would do. So Mark held that job for 12 months, and then I heard that he lost it. But the interesting thing was Mark never came back in the office to apply for food stamps again. Instead, I didn't see him for 10 years. And then here I was 10 years later, commuting to a job in another community. It's about 5:45 in the morning, and I'm stopping by a gas station to pick up a cup of coffee to stay awake on the road. And who do I see for the first time in 10 years? But I see Mark. So I look at him, and he looks like a regular workaday Joe. So I ask him, what are you doing? He said he's on his way to work at a local factory. Mark had changed his life, and I'd had something to do with it. He'd gone 10 years in the workforce, and I was much impressed. So you could say a faith-based perception about why the current system does not work is there's far too many critical judgments. And those people who receive assistance and get stuck in the system get stuck for two ways. There's two patterns that people have that are both dysfunctional ways of responding to be critically judged. The more typical pattern involves a loss of self-esteem, self-worth, depression, withdrawal, and quite often drugs and alcohol. A less common, but where the system gets a bad rap, is when people respond in an angry, hostile way. If they think you're critically judging them, they're in your face. And that's what Mark used to do when he got in people's face. He said, why should I work when I get food stamps? He was actually reacting to being critically judged by people in a way that he knew would get under their skin. So the implications for leaders is there's a positive correlation between the critical judgments of supervisors, managers, and team members and corporate challenges. Let me repeat that. There's a positive correlation between the critical judgments of supervisors, managers, and team members and corporate challenges. Leaders who critically judge compromise their capacity to lead. So then they're forced to rely more upon power, authority, and control, or if you will, management, in order to cause people to act. And when you manage instead of lead, you really create creativity, passion, enthusiasm, and performance to that which it takes to minimally comply. So we're going to talk now about an underutilized gift. We each perceive the world creatively, and we can actually intentionally perceive the world creatively. And what I mean by that is perceive the world in an empowering way. So from this disciplined way of looking, perceiving is a creative act. It does involve all five of our senses. And then the way we perceive things is always influenced by our knowledge, our beliefs, and our past experiences. And we have a God-given capability to perceive any person or situation at any moment in ways that expand possibilities. Let me repeat that. We have a God-given capability to perceive any person or situation at any moment in ways that expand possibilities. So let me tell you a quick story about a CEO. We'll say his name was Dave. So I did this training about feedback to Dave and a group of his peers. It was a CEO group. And the whole focus of the session was how we can transform feedback into an awesome gift, and the importance of giving positive feedback and the importance of giving constructive feedback. So this CEO, Dave, realized that he had not been giving his people much feedback. So he proceeded to intentionally go out and reach every person on his leadership team and have a conversation with them and give them positive feedback to let them know how much he appreciated and valued their work. And he shared with me after he did that it actually paid off some benefits for him. He was able to get a real positive response and engagement, and especially one of the people in particular responded in an incredibly powerful way to his positive feedback. So if you were to look up the definition of assumption in the dictionary, Merriam-Webster's dictionary, you'll find definition 1A is the lifting up of a person into heaven. What an awesome definition of assumption. And by assumption, what I mean is a taking for granted or without proof that something is true. And I want you to know that you, like me, can thoughtfully craft useful assumptions to make an empowering impact upon members of your team. Let me repeat that. You can thoughtfully craft useful assumptions to make an empowering impact upon members of your team. So here's an example of what I mean by looking at some useful assumptions that I made as it relates to Mark that I worked with. One was that change is always possible. Another is that people are interested in and capable of making positive changes in spite of words or actions to the contrary. And I'll bet each of you know someone who you think, based upon their words and actions, is not at all interested in making positive changes. Certainly that's the way Mark appeared to be. And people can get stuck in a reactive stance, reacting to critical judgments of others in a very dysfunctional way. Finally, you can empower someone to change with minimal investment of time or effort. So in the case of Mark, you could say I invested the 90 minutes in that initial encounter where I kept myself from getting the tar knocked out of me. And they had a couple of small talk conversations within the lasted maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes in length, before he landed that job and worked for 12 months. And then we went to lunch together. So maybe we had a total of maybe 3 hours of investment time. And he changed his life. So what we're talking about is using assumptions as a way to empower people. And by empowering people, what I mean is you're expanding someone's personal experience of their capabilities and choices. Or you're kindling or rekindling a personal vision, and you're causing someone to take action to achieve these possibilities. So you may have seen a TV show called Highway to Heaven. In that show, Michael Landon starred as Jonathan, who was an angel. And he had a buddy named Mark that used to always say to Jonathan, "You got the stuff." And when he said you got the stuff, what he was talking about was that Jonathan had the power of an angel to create miracles. What I want you to know is you and I have got a different kind of stuff. You and I have a God-given gift to be able to empower people. The more we use this gift, the more we develop this gift, the more effective we can become. So it's like first being a spark and empowering people, and then one day literally becoming a friggin' lightning bolt. We have the ability to affect dramatic change in the lives of people that we interact with. It's a learned skill. It's a gift from God, and we all have it. Now, here are some quotes from success stories. Again, these are the people that were highlighted in the newspaper that have made major changes in their life about the experience of empowerment and how the community supported them. One person said, quote, "It makes all the difference when people believe in you enough to make you believe in yourself." Another person said, "Their caring worked. I did it." Another person said, "People were believing in an ability that I didn't see. If Keith saw something that I didn't see, then it must be there because I trust his judgment." That was written by someone who, when I met her children were under the care of Indiana's welfare system because there was a concern that she might harm her children. What struck me that day when I met her, and I was listening to her in administrative review, what struck me was that she was able to so clearly articulate her mental health diagnosis and its implications upon her life. My conclusion about her was she's smart, because at the time I was studying the DSM-3, 3R I think it was called at the time, and I'm thinking, if she can have such a clear grasp upon her diagnosis and its implications, she's intelligent. So I started nudging her and encouraging her when I had the opportunities. Helped her connect with another agency, helped her become self-sufficient. That agency got her hooked up with a GED program. She wound up with a teacher and a tutor and a mentor and a case manager, a whole team of people that were supporting her in her success. And she was able to be so responsive to the feedback she was getting from all these people that I decided to have her help us provide training for mentor volunteers. So we're preparing for the very first time that she was going to become a mentor, help with a mentoring training. And I was going over the script for the training and explaining to her different places where I was hoping that she and her mentor would help by sharing their perspective about how they were doing different things in the training. And then she asked me in the midst of that, "Could I ask you a couple questions?" And I said, "Sure, what are your questions?" So she asked me, "Why is it that you want those of us that are going to have a mentor to benefit from this program, but you're only training the mentors? Don't you think it would be helpful for those of us that are going to have a mentor to understand how the program is supposed to work too?" Those two questions caused us to change our mentoring program. And I can tell you, when we started training the mentors and the people that were going to have a mentor together, it became a much more effective program. And then I had a chance to lead a training for 3 counties that were interested in the work that we were doing, and especially in the mentoring program. And so we were speaking to 150 people, and I invited this person that provided this quote and her mentor to join me in leading this mentoring training. Who do you suppose is the most effective person to provide training to this 150 people? If you guessed it was the mentee, you are 100% correct. She had this incredible personality, this charisma, this way of engaging an audience in a very playful way. She was so captivating, and she also could really tell her story in a very impactful way. She was the star. So during the time that I knew her, she got her high school equivalency. She went on to school and got a 2-year degree in human services. Then she went to work full-time for the domestic violence shelter that she had once stayed at because she too was a victim of domestic violence. When I last saw her, she was working full-time and doing very well. So here are some examples outside of the welfare system. And if you look first at the picture, you could say we all live our life like we live in a box. The box represents what's possible. Or you could say the box represents what we're comfortable with. Because we all have an area that we're not really comfortable with, and quite often we'll steer away from things we're not comfortable with. So I was leading a training for a corporation, the corporate leadership team of a company. And because I was working with the corporate leadership team, I knew the most important person in the room was the CEO. So I had the CEO in front of the room for an exercise to start the 1-hour training because I knew the person I needed to influence the most was the CEO. So I wanted to get him engaged right away. So the first exercise, I had everyone in his leadership team give him positive feedback. I wish you could see how uncomfortable he was in front of the room, sitting in this chair, waiting for this exercise to start. And then as he listened carefully to positive feedback from member after member of his leadership team, you could see his body posture change, his facial expressions change, as he really was letting the positive feedback in. After that session was over, he approached me and he said, I really want to thank you. Before today's session, I've been questioning my effectiveness as a leader. Then when I listened to what the members of my leadership team had to say, I really got how effective that I am. So I just really want to thank you. So that was a 10-minute exercise that made that kind of effect upon a CEO. Then there's another gentleman I was working with. He's an entrepreneur, a coach and a trainer, and he lives in South Africa. And I was working with him using webinar technology. This is a 1-hour training on feedback. And 24 hours later, he sent me a text message, and this is what he said. Hey, Keith, I used your word helpful with 2 people, and the results were so fascinating. Both accepted my constructive comments, thanked me for helping them. That had not been his experience in giving people constructive feedback in the past. And that was what was possible after 1 hour of training with me. So there's a woman named Marianne Williamson, and she's very well known in the faith circles. She's an author, and she's a public speaker and a trainer. She once said, we're all meant to shine as children do. And if you look at the picture of the face, you can see this baby is clearly shining. And we all have the capability to shine like that. And when we do, we're a joy to be around. And one of the ways you can tell in which you're being effective in empowering people is when you can get them to shine like a baby, just like that. And you may find when you first work with people that they may not shine like that right away because they're going to be a little mistrustful about what you're up to. It may take them a few times before they're able to respond in that way. And then the more you practice the skill, the more effective you become. So I sent one of my clients a social media message. And the message was an uplifting one, empowering one. And this is what he sent in response. Thank you ever so kindly, Keith. I like the response. You can't see my eyes now, but they are gleaming like a torch. And he and I both knew that he was shining just like this baby. I could picture his face. So here's a couple faith-based assumptions, faith-related assumptions that you might find to be useful. One is that each person is a child of God. And actually, that's not an assumption. That's in the Bible, that we're made in God's image with gifts for humanity still hidden within. Now, this is the assumption part, with gifts for humanity still hidden within. Because if we're truly a child of God, made in God's image, then we do have some gifts that are hidden within us. And then another assumption is that faith-based leadership includes helping people unleash their hidden gifts. And so we assume everyone has hidden gifts and that we can help them unleash them. Two powerful assumptions that relate to our faith. So moving on to learning and leadership. Effective leadership involves a learned skill set. This skill set can be honed through disciplined practice, and that practice involves sensory acuity as to how your actions are influenced, how other people's actions are influenced by yours. So you could say whenever a leader acts, a leader pays attention to the actions of others and recognizes or owns that the actions of others are in part a reaction or response to his or her own actions. And the more you pay attention to your actions, the more effective you can become in influencing the actions of others. And what you'll find is different people will respond to different actions in useful ways. So leadership skills can actually be honed then in the everyday process of working with people. Because each time you're interacting with somebody, you could say you're involved in the opportunity to influence them in a powerful way, in an empowering way. And anyone can hone leadership skills to empower people. We're not talking about something that's a position of authority. We're talking about a position of influence. Any person can choose to develop their skills to influence or persuade people in ways that open up possibilities for others. And then most importantly, there's no limit as to how effective we can become in empowering people. And again, it does not matter who we're talking about, where their walk of life is, how much they've already accomplished. The possibility is there's still more hidden within. So many years ago, I worked with somebody who was receiving public assistance. She became a partner in the work that we were doing to transform our county's welfare system, and she was an active partner engaged in our work for several years. She created this, she had an artistic talent, and she created this figure that you're looking at right now, and we called this figure Sparky. She created Sparky as a logo for the work that she and a team of other people that were receiving help used as a way to spark other people to take action to change their lives in a positive direction. And she, of course, was taking action to change her life in a positive direction too. So she actually helped with a newsletter. It was an inspirational newsletter for people receiving help, written by people that were receiving help. And she also started a food bank because she thought it was really important. And there were probably a dozen people who worked with her on this food bank. And they all had been people that had once been on assistance, and some still were, yet they thought it was really important to give back, to have a place where they could volunteer and treat people with dignity and respect so that no one had to go hungry while they were waiting to get their food stamps. They ran that as volunteers for 5 years. Then, in this picture, the gentleman on the right is a young Governor Evan Bayh. Evan Bayh came to our 3-year anniversary to transform one county's welfare system in the state of Indiana. He's got his right hand upon the shoulder of Betty Knox. He was so inspired, empowered by Betty Knox, he walked out of the room from that celebration, the 3-year anniversary celebration that day. He told his direct reports he wanted to do something like this in every county in the state of Indiana. And that proceeded to become 3 pilot counties projects and our Indiana's launching of welfare reform. Well, he was especially empowered by Betty Knox that day because Betty Knox shared with the governor that she herself had once been on assistance, and she had managed to get her education and work her way off. And she thought it was so important that people know there's a way out that she then reached out and became a mentor for a mentoring program to help someone else find their way out. And the governor was empowered by the possibility of getting people that had once been on assistance involved as mentors to help other people out too. Unfortunately, in most communities, people like Betty will not show their face because they're so critically judged by their experience of being on assistance that most people do not want to carry that critical judgment with them anymore. So they don't share about their past for fear of being critically judged in the present. So here's a call to action. I invite you to send me an email to request a handout. And this handout makes it easy for you to use this call to action. In this handout, you're going to get a set of assumptions. And I invite you to select one assumption from the handout that you believe you could potentially use to expand your capacity to empower people. Then for the next 30 days, interact with at least one person each workday as if that particular assumption were true. Act as if that assumption were true in your work with that person. And record any significant observations in a journal. And this is something that can take less than 10 minutes in a given day. And then once you get through 30 days, if you find that you're able to make a difference in the lives of people, I invite you to select another promising assumption for each subsequent 30 days. So I want to thank you. It's absolutely a privilege for me to be leading this webinar for you. I want to acknowledge you for your faith and for your interest in how you can take your faith and use that to be more effective as a leader. I want you to know it's an absolute privilege for me to be working with you. My final call to action is I invite you to provide me with any helpful feedback. And you can do this by sending me an email to keith@level3bydesign.com. And please provide me any feedback that you want and let me know that you're interested in the call to action. I'd be thrilled to send it to you. So thank you so much. It's truly a privilege to be working with you today. I wish you God's blessing, and I invite you to join me in empowering people as one way that we can use the gifts that were given by God to make a greater difference in the world. Thank you and have a great day. God bless.